people feel utterly overwhelmed by the amount of content. It's become impossible to sift through. The service that social media used to do a great job at, which is, I'd like to read around an issue a bunch of different, interesting, fair, honest perspectives around some shared facts, is like impossible. There's no platform that does that service for you anymore. We had an idea that, there's going to be like 5 competing social networks. It'll be Snap and Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and StumbleUpon or something, and they'll be frantically competing by who has the best content. And that just didn't turn out to be true. It was just Facebook. For the seller to survive, you need like bidders and a real market, and there really wasn't one for content.
What is Semafor's take on AI? Because you seem to have embraced it both as a tool.
It's an incredibly powerful tool for research. It's funny because I think there's a misperception that like most of what journalists do is type. But most journalism, really like the core of it and the valuable part is that you're gathering new information, context. AI mostly has not replaced that. Facebook had been tweaking its knobs so that engagement was favored over just sort of passive consumption. And by engagement, that meant comments. And so the thing with more comments gets shown to more people. And we were pretty good at that, but like who was really good at that was Donald Trump.
If you don't know, Ben has been at the center of the digital media universe for quite a while now, and so that's where I want to begin. You wrote this book, Traffic, which I have here in hardcover form. It basically covers the ascendance of digital media and sort of its ultimate demise, at least in terms of advertising-supported big venture-backed media companies like BuzzFeed and Vice and Gawker and that whole world, Mashable, et cetera. I would love to know what you learned as a participant in that ascendance when you ran BuzzFeed News, and what you learned as somebody who basically spent, I'm sure, a year or more talking to everybody involved and thinking deeply about that world.
Yeah, that's the whole book, so I'll try to narrow it. But, it's interesting, because I think one of the questions, after I wrote the book, actually, that people ask was just, what the hell was anybody thinking putting $100 million, $200 million into these companies? Like, in retrospect, that was just such unbelievable folly. And like NBC Universal still owns a bunch of like illiquid BuzzFeed shares. And the answer to that, actually, it's interesting, but is basically that a lot of the people who ran those companies, started those companies, had been around the founding of MTV and of Viacom, and had seen a technology, the wires, get laid into the ground. Everybody plugs in their wires, and then you need content. And the people who laid the wires, the Comcasts of the world, the Time Warner Cables of the world, made a lot of money, but so did, and then the people who made the content that was sort of specially suited to those wires made a lot of money. So that would have been, MTV and ESPN and CNN and HBO and all these new like cable-specific content providers. And so people like Tom Freston, who had been, the kind of the genius behind MTV, Kenny Lear, who was the chairman of Vice, Kenny Lear, the chairman of BuzzFeed, brilliant comms guy who had been around the beginnings of MTV and been at Viacom, saw the rise of social media and digital media and thought, okay, here are these new pipes. We're gonna invest in the content that fits those pipes, and eventually that stuff's gonna be valuable and make money. And that was like a pretty compelling pitch, and it made sense at the time. And you can even imagine a world that works out differently, where the monetization is different, where Facebook and Twitter and Snap and YouTube wind up having to pay for the content. But basically the rise of user-generated content produced a totally different outcome that maybe everybody should have seen all along. But I think that's the thing that kind of when you pull way back, it's like, oh, that wasn't a crazy bet. It just didn't work out that way.
And so it didn't work out because of the rise of user-generated content, of basically a model of consumption and a model of filling the platforms with content that did not need to be paid for.
Yeah, and of the near, I always get this confused, which is a monopoly and which is a monopsony or whatever, but like the dominant power of Facebook in particular. Because so we had an idea that, well, there's going to be like 5 competing social networks. It'll be Snap and Facebook and Twitter and Pinterest and StumbleUpon or something, and they'll be frantically competing by who has the best content. The way, actually, in a way like Netflix and, Amazon Prime are now. And that just didn't turn out to be true. It was just Facebook for like a period of 5 years in the 2010s. And so like the seller needs, for the seller to survive, you need like bidders and a real market. And there really wasn't one for content.
Can you give us a sense of what that
we also made like a million mistakes and other things.
Well, we may want to talk about some of those. But my next question is basically, can you give us a sense of what the peak of that era was? You were a part of it at BuzzFeed, Vice. Those are kind of the names that come up a lot, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, I like have this very specific memory. I think it was, I can't remember the date, but it was like March 11th of 2015, and it was just like in the morning of that day, a couple of llamas got loose in Arizona. I don't know if you remember this. Like everyone on the entire internet was just like was talking about these, and these sheriffs were chasing them around, and the llamas kept getting free, and it was just like a very fun morning. And of a sort of like this kind of goofy new mass culture where like everyone in the country on social media is having like basically nice, harmless conversations with each other about some silly thing. And then in the afternoon, because this really was at BuzzFeed, this woman messaged us that she'd been at a wedding, sent a message through Tumblr that she'd been at a wedding, and that she was arguing with her mother about what color this dress was that they'd taken a picture of. Her mother was wearing it. And she thought it was black and blue, and the mother thought it was white and gold, and like, BuzzFeed, could you help us figure it out? And pretty soon everybody is standing behind the computer of the editor who has got this message, like, what the hell is this, arguing about it? And so we posted it, like, what color is this dress? And it was vastly the most traffic we'd ever gotten, and we got a lot of traffic. And, I think, we had like, I can't remember the numbers, but tens of millions of people saw it. A colleague of mine was in Jakarta giving a speech an hour after we posted it, and all the questions were about that in Jakarta. And it was just this kind of moment of like simultaneous global culture in a way that felt like really nice, actually. It was just like a silly thing like you'd find on the back page of a newspaper, of an old magazine or something, that like, is this a vase or is it a person's face? Like very silly, in a very traditional way, kind of, fun, harmless culture. And we thought, like, wow, this is kind of a neat new thing that we're going to be at the heart of. And Facebook, and I remember my boss, Jonah, and part of our superpower was that he was talking to executives at Facebook all the time. So
Jonah Peretti. Yeah.
So we had a sense of their kind of direction. And he was talking to somebody at a senior there who said, wasn't that cool? And they said, no, that felt scary. That felt like we had lost control of our own system. Like we got to figure out how to make sure that doesn't happen again. Although and then we realized as we tried to replicate it that the thing that made it really work was that it was divisive, like in the most harmless way, right? But like you had people divided. A third of people thought it was black and blue. 2/3 thought it was white and gold. And we started like replicating that in like other silly ways, like olives apparently are very divisive. Do you like olives? Like some people do, some don't. And so you like make a post about that, and people argue about it. And Facebook had been tweaking its knobs so that engagement was favored over just sort of passive consumption. And by engagement, that meant comments. Because all these abstract terms, and so like they talk about the algorithm, it's always like very dumb. It's like they're counting the number of comments. And so the thing with more comments gets shown to more people. And we were pretty good at that, but like who was really good at that was Donald Trump. Like he would like say something, and somebody would say that's racist, and then somebody else would say no, you're racist, and like that stuff really took off. And the system that Facebook had built and was starting to lose control of to really try to promote stuff that people would stick to and talk about pretty quickly just sort of morphed into the most divisive politics.
Well, we made it almost 8 minutes without talking about Donald Trump, but I
haven't talked about AI at all.
We'll get there. What strikes me is you bring up this era, is it's almost a forgotten era of when the internet was kind of nice and kind of fun, and maybe we misremember it a little bit, but I think in reality it really was a little bit more innocent and a little bit more playful. BuzzFeed had the watermelon with the rubber bands and those sorts of things.
Our slogan was no haters, which was challenging for the journalists.
Yeah, there was that other publication that was just about positive. It was in the book, and I'm totally blanking on the name, but it was
Upworthy.
Upworthy. There we go. Thank you. Those things, I think, don't exist anymore, and I don't really think anybody's really working on them. But was the change merely Donald Trump, or was it the maturation of these social networks and the realization internally that divisiveness of almost any kind, polarization, arguments, that stuff really sells?
I mean, I think as always, if you ask a journalist like what caused this, they'll always be like, it was this one thing. And if you ask a historian, they'll be like, there were 93 factors. And so, yes, all of those things. I do think that, there is a sort of like after 2016, I think there was this sort of easy idea that, well, Facebook caused Trump and Brexit, and like the Russians somehow in Cambridge Analytica were involved. Like, don't bother me with the details, but something bad happened. And I guess my own sort of experience and observation is more that these platforms, didn't cause the backlash to globalization or right-wing populism or a generation of older and more conservative people getting onto the internet. Like, those were all real existing things that didn't get caused by social media. But the social media happened to be and kind of leaned into a kind of architecture and engineering that certainly could have been purpose-built, although it wasn't, for that kind of populism embodied by Trump, but also Modi and also Bolsonaro. And it was not particularly American. I mean, that's sort of where you see the trend, this real surge of a kind of politics that, that particularly was built for that era of Facebook, by the way, which is ancient history at this point. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. So just to segue into Semafor a little bit, what about your experience of that era and your research on that era via Traffic shaped the way that you approached building and structuring Semafor? And I know you're not the CEO, but you are a co-founder, editor-in-chief, and I'm sure you had a lot of say in some of those.
Spokesman. Yeah, I mean, I think, I was there and I left in BuzzFeed in 2019 and then was at the New York Times for a couple of years where I had a kind of like front row seat to all the insane things happening in media and got to throw stones at other people's glass houses, which was fun. And I think, the thing that I think sometimes people miss is just to the extent to which in those like really optimistic early days of the web and blogs, which I'm old enough to have been around for, started some blogs here and there's at Politico and we started that. And although I wasn't a co-founder, I was a blogger. And then at BuzzFeed in the beginning, was that they were really responding to things that consumers really wanted. Like if you were reading the news in 2004 and 2005, it was really hard. It had been really hard to get perspectives that were not that of the American government, which suddenly had been really discredited. And the ability to read alternate views of the Iraq War in particular from the foreign press or from the liberal press here was really powerful and interesting. And then there was this kind of like, and it sort of sounds insane to say now, but people felt like I don't have enough information. Like I don't know how to, like I'm running, like I've read, like I remember around after 9/11 actually feeling like I had read everything on the internet and I had to just like keep hitting refresh on sites hoping that something new would pop up. Sure. And there was this sense that, which was accurate, that the media was controlled by the people who own broadcast towers and printing presses. And a lot of the opening of the internet was like a really organic response to that. And this moment is totally different, right? Like people feel utterly overwhelmed by the amount of content. It's become impossible to sift through. The service that social media used to do a great job at, which is find me, I'd like to read around an issue a bunch of different, interesting, fair, honest perspectives and sort of figure out where I stand, but around some shared facts is like impossible. Yep. No, there's no platform that does that service for you anymore. And so a lot of what we thought about at Semafor is like, how do we, offer the sort of authority that comes with really strong beat reporting by somebody who knows what they're doing, but also a real openness to diverse perspectives in a sense that we're bringing in legitimate points of view from all over, and including, by the way, global perspectives, because so many, like all the big stories, social media, the rise of the sort of new right, COVID, are totally global stories. You can't really understand them nationally. And so I think in a way, media isn't a fixed thing. It's always responding to what people want and need in a moment, and that's what people want and need in this moment.
Right. So editorially speaking, global lens, somewhat neutral. It's not a tribal publication. It's not like certain Substacks, and you don't have to have a certain political affiliation to enjoy and be a part of the Semafor community. What did it influence in terms of the business model? Because it's not, I would imagine, the same kind of thing that BuzzFeed was going for, or these
Funny
companies.
story. Actually, my partner Justin Smith, who's really one of the great media CEOs and had been at Bloomberg, at some point when I was at BuzzFeed, tragically, it had gotten so bad that somebody said to me, like, you should really be the one who figures out revenue, which was like, I should have known that was going to end badly for the news division, which had essentially operated. It had a bunch of, early on, it kind of really made sense that we were doing news, and then as budgets got tight, it made less and less sense. And I took Justin out to lunch, and he explained to me how news businesses work, and I was like, oh, I wish I worked with someone like that. But I think for us, and I think for news businesses that are successful, a big part of it is that you're ideally reaching a very informed audience. You're reaching the people who are making really important high stakes decisions, and you're reaching people who not necessarily you're trying to sell consumer goods to, but who various kinds of advertisers are trying to reach with their messages. And so for us, our business is basically split 50-50 between advertising and events. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of corporate brand reputation advertising, which is where, and I think if you look at the successful media news startups of the last decade, it's Politico, it's Axios, it's Punchbowl. It's a very Washington-centric group, and that's part of why.
Yeah, makes sense. This is a bit of a non sequitur, but when you worked at the New York Times, you were a media columnist there for a couple of years. What did you learn about the New York Times that is not obvious, even to a somewhat savvy, reader of the Times or fan of media? Yeah,
I mean, honestly, like I had never really worked inside like a great institution that took itself seriously and I think I was really blown away by the kind of the people who just felt incredibly loyal to the institution, who were focused on making my story. Like there was an editor who worked Saturdays, and the first editor, Carolyn Ryan, just unbelievably great story editor, would like make my story like 50% edgier and also shorter, and just great editor. And then on Saturday, Phyllis Messenger, who was I think they used to be called copy editors there, and now they have some other title, but like would just do an incredibly thorough, careful read of the story, catch stuff that was maybe comprehensible to insiders, but a normal Times reader wouldn't understand, and just like did just unbelievably strong job. There's this whole layer of people who don't have bylines, who aren't tweeting about anything, but who are like just deeply, deeply committed to the institution, that actually really kind of impressed me. I mean, I realize that's kind of a naive thing to say, but I guess that's how good institutions work.
I think I was expecting something a little bit more gossipy, something a little bit more...
Either they're super woke or not woke enough.
Something like that.
I feel like I've totally lost the plot on which one of those I'm supposed to say now.
Okay, we'll move on then. There's been a lot of talk of AI. I promised we would get to AI. The panel that preceded us, Tony and Peter, said a lot of maybe not so nice things about AI. Semafor has kind of embraced AI.
Those are just humans talking their book.
Who is?
Tony,
are.
Yeah.
Okay. But you are not.
No, I'm a huge fan of Tony's,
Okay.
as humans go. Sorry, what's the question?
The question is, what is Semafor's take on AI? Because you seem to have embraced it both as a tool and maybe in other means as well.
I mean, it's an incredibly powerful tool for research, I would say. Like, I don't think... I mean, it's funny because I think there's a misperception that, like, most of what journalists do is type. Like, you're just sitting all day typing words and putting the words on the internet. And there's, like, a slice of media that's mostly dead now that was trying to write, like, really fast. Like, if you could write 10, like, SEO articles an hour on, like, how to use a toaster, you could make $15 an hour, and if like there was a sort of bottom of the internet kind of media that was about just churning, like words, without gathering new information. But most journalism, really like the core of it and the valuable part is that you're gathering new information, context, and so I think like the AI mostly has not replaced that. Like that's not its great strength. Its strength is writing words, but certain kinds of research so valuable. Like we have this product called Signals that is about pulling in. There's a new piece of news breaks. We're trying to do, in a sense, what social media used to do, which here are 3 or 4 really interesting, intelligent, sophisticated views from different perspectives on the same piece of news, and machine translation, which is a form of AI, is just one of like the great marvels of the age. Like I feel like it doesn't get hyped up enough. Like the Tower of Babel was a big deal, and we've reversed it. It's crazy. But also, you can say like, I don't know what news broke this morning or whatever. Like Trump appointed somebody. What's the reaction in the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean press? Like you could go find that using Google and machine translation, and it would take forever. But actually, you can now use a combination, or I'm sure there are different ways to do it. We're using like a Bing OpenAI integration where you can just search that and it will bring you a bunch of articles from the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean press that you then do have to go check and make sure the translations are right and that that it's not some weirdo publication. But like, what a cool thing! Like that's an incredibly useful use case that our reporters actually use and that is very useful. It's also like we use it as, instead of having a copy desk actually, where there's a great ChatGPT prompt that we use for copy editing.
And so now I'm talking your book. Well, I already talked your book, but it also seems core to the Semafor mission or point of view in that you're now getting primary source material from around the world that can inform your writers and make their stories actually reflective of what the Japanese press or the Chinese press is saying.
Yeah, and I think it's just part of our value proposition is here are some different, we're not going to try to resolve everyone's differences, but we're going to try to articulately present different points of view. And it helps with that.
The New York editorial board.
Oh, yeah.
If you're not aware, Ben and many others kind of in the New York media ecosystem, when the New York Times stopped endorsing candidates in local races, created the New York editorial board to kind of take on that function. Why was that important?
It is. It's interesting because I'm basically more bullish than most people on news, on journalism, on the idea that you can build successful, thriving news businesses, and and that people really want this, and in various ways you can monetize it. Really, except when it comes to local news, it's so hard. It's such a hard business. The scale that these great metro newspapers got in the 20th century was based around, kind of having a regional advertising monopoly, in things that are really hard to rebuild. And a lot of my best friends are, building local publications. And if you can get 10 reporters, 15 reporters, 20 reporters at a local nonprofit or a for-profit, that's amazing. But these places had 600 journalists, and we're paying for it by taxing every mattress sold in Indianapolis, basically, because the only way to sell mattresses was to advertise in the Indianapolis Star. And that era is just so over. And so so for various reasons, the New York Times has gotten, and the Times recognizes that as a national publication now. That's where its business is. I think it ought to have feel some level of civic responsibility to help inform people of because who knows because it was one of the few places you could help you figure out who to vote for mayor, for city council. And it, for various reasons which have nothing to do with New York, actually got out of that business. And so I think a lot of local journalists felt wow, this is a real service. Maybe not even the endorsement, but just interviewing candidates, putting them through their paces, putting the transcripts on the internet so people can see them, at least at a start. So we're going to start doing that later this year.
For any races in particular?
Got to start with the mayor's race, right?
Yeah, okay. That'll be an interesting one. We are going back to Trump. How does a publication deal with a second Trump administration? Again, not to go back to Tony and Peter, but I do think the themes that they drew on in that discussion are relevant in that I think a lot of media organizations are rightfully scared to take on the administration and to be too critical lest that administration use some tools at its disposal to make life very difficult for those media organizations. What is your take on that?
So I guess I tend to think that for like individual journalists, like American journalists, like to talk about how dangerous it is for us and how scary it is out there. But actually, as of now, and like knock on wood, it's a pretty great place to be a journalist. We have a lot of protections, and people shouldn't complain so much. And there are parts of the world where it is really terrifyingly dangerous all the time. The Committee to Protect Journalists has its event later this week, where like a bunch of people who have been jailed and beaten up are, will be talking.
This is a good reminder to donate to CPJ, please.
You're a really great
yeah.
organization. But on the other hand, I think if you are a big kind of consolidated corporate media outlet, or if you're a billionaire who owns media along with other regulated businesses, and this is honestly where governments around the world have really exercised their muscle. Like you can harass individual journalists, but you can also just scare broadcasters into a kind of like, maybe we shouldn't air that programming, maybe we shouldn't cross that line. And it's not like there's going to be a memo or like a meeting where they decide to take it easy on Donald Trump, but I do think there's a level of fear in a world of big corporate media where a huge part of their agenda in the coming couple of years is mergers, many of which will require federal approval, and I would be, they would not be, complying with their responsibility to their shareholders if they were worried about this, and I think that's also true of billionaires who own media and who have other projects, whether it's space exploration or whether it's pharmaceuticals that are very, very heavily regulated by the federal government or contracted by the federal government. Like, how could you not think about that? It's actually where the New York Times, I think, is in a pretty amazing but also sort of scary place. Is the only really big, powerful American media outlet that's independent.
Ben Smith, thank you very much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Smith.
Thank you.